This was the life of a coal miner in the USA. It was 5:30 in the morning on November 20th, 1968. In a small corner of Marion County, West Virginia, 99 men had already been underground for hours, deep inside the Consolidation Coal Company's number 9 mine near the towns of Farmington and Mannington. Some were fathers, some were grandfathers. Most had worked that same mine for years, following the same tunnels, breathing the same air, trusting the same timbers holding the ceiling above their heads. Then, without warning, a massive explosion tore through the mine. The blast was so powerful it shook windows in Fairmont, nearly 12 miles away. In the chaos that followed, 21 men managed to scramble out alive. 78 never came home, and the bodies of 19 of those men were never recovered. The mine was sealed 9 days later, with the dead still inside. What kind of life leads a man to that moment? What pushes a person to descend into the earth day after day, year after year, knowing that the rock above his head could come down at any second, that a pocket of methane gas could turn the air itself into fire? And why, in 1968, were there still 311 coal miners dying in work-related accidents every single year in the United States, a country that had already put astronauts into orbit? The answers are buried deep in the mountains of Appalachia, in the company towns where miners lived and died, in the union halls where their voices were supposed to be heard, but often were not. This is the life of an American coal miner in 1968. Before we continue, comment below if you have ever worked in a dangerous job. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our upcoming content. Thank you for your support, and let's continue. Long before the sun came up over the hills of West Virginia, Kentucky, or southwestern Pennsylvania, the coal miner was already awake. There was no sleeping in. The mine ran on its own clock, and that clock waited for no one. By 4 or 4:30 in the morning, men across the Appalachian coal fields were pulling on heavy canvas work clothes, lacing up steel-toed boots, and eating whatever breakfast their wives had managed to put together in the dark. The drive to the mine was short for most. These men lived close, many of them in homes owned by the same company that employed them. When they arrived at the mine entrance, the first stop was the lamp room. Each miner signed in and collected his cap lamp, a battery-powered light mounted to his helmet. That lamp was his only source of visibility for the next 8 to 10 hours. He also picked up his self-rescuer, a small device worn on the belt that could filter carbon monoxide from the air for roughly an hour. Barely enough time to find a way out if something went wrong. Then came the cage, a steel elevator that dropped the men down the shaft into the earth. Depending on the mine, that descent could take them anywhere from a few hundred feet to over 1,000 feet below the surface. When the cage stopped and the doors opened, the world above ceased to exist. There was no daylight, no sky, no weather. There was only the tunnel, the sound of machinery echoing through the rock, the smell of diesel and dust, and the work that had to be done before any of them could go home. Inside the mine, the work was relentless and physically brutal. By 1968, many operations had moved away from hand tools and toward mechanized equipment. The continuous miner, a massive machine with a rotating drum studded with carbide teeth, could tear coal from the seam far faster than any crew with pickaxes. But machines did not eliminate the danger. They changed it. Men still had to operate those machines in tunnels that were sometimes only 4 feet high, crouching or crawling through spaces filled with coal dust so thick it coated the lungs with every breath. Roof bolters drove steel rods into the ceiling to keep it from collapsing, a constant reminder that the rock above was not stable. Shuttle cars hauled the coal from the face back to the conveyor belts, moving in reverse through narrow passages in near total darkness. A loader operator who miscalculated could pin a man against a rib wall in seconds. Electricians worked on high-voltage equipment in wet conditions, with coal dust floating through the air around them. Fire bosses, experienced miners assigned to safety inspection, walked the tunnels before each shift, checking for methane concentrations with handheld detectors. If the gas reading was too high, the shift was supposed to stop. But production pressure was real, and not every foreman followed the rules. Men knew it. They went in anyway. Pulling 12 tons of coal per man per day was the standard expectation in many underground operations. Every ton mattered. Every minute counted. The company was watching the numbers. The coal dust never left. A miner came out of the ground at the end of his shift looking like a different person. The only clean areas on his face were around his eyes and mouth, two pale circles surrounded by black. If the mine had shower facilities, he could wash before the drive home. Many did not. He would carry the dust home on his skin, in his hair, in the creases of his hands. But the dust that mattered most was the dust he could not see and could not wash off. It had already traveled deep into his lungs. Coal workers' pneumoconiosis, known to everyone as black lung, was not a new disease in 1968. Miners had been dying from it for generations, but the medical establishment had been slow to recognize it, and the coal industry had been even slower to acknowledge it. The disease works silently. Coal dust accumulates in the tissue of the lungs over years and decades, causing inflammation, scarring, and a progressive loss of the ability to breathe. In the early stages, there are no symptoms. A man feels fine. He goes to work. He breathes more dust. By the time the coughing starts and the breathlessness sets in, the damage is already severe and irreversible. In 1968, there were no federal compensation programs for black lung victims. A miner who could no longer work because his lungs had failed him was largely on his own. His union, the United Mine Workers of America, had done little to fight for recognition of the disease. Many miners did not even know what was happening inside their own bodies until it was too late. The company town was not just a place to live. It was a system of control. Across the coal fields of West Virginia, Kentucky, Virginia, and Pennsylvania, mining companies had built entire communities from the ground up. Rows of identical houses, a company-owned church, a company-owned school, and at the center of it all, the company store. Miners were often paid not in U.S. currency, but in scrip, tokens, or paper notes printed by the company itself that could only be spent at company-owned establishments. A miner who wanted to buy groceries, pay rent, or get his boots resoled had to do it through the company. If he fell behind on his rent, which he paid to the company, or ran up a tab at the company store, that debt was deducted directly from his wages before he ever saw a paycheck. The system made it nearly impossible to save money and very difficult to leave. Moving required money, and money was exactly what these men never seemed to have enough of. By 1968, the most rigid forms of the scrip system had faded in most areas, replaced by cash wages. But the structure of dependency remained. In many mining communities, the coal company still owned the land, still controlled the local economy, and still held enormous influence over local government. A miner who complained too loudly about safety conditions might find himself passed over for better shifts. One who organized his co-workers too aggressively might find himself without a job at all. The mountains were full of men who knew exactly what the rules were, even when nobody said them out loud. The United Mine Workers of America had been one of the most powerful labor unions in American history. under the leadership of John L. Lewis, who served as president from 1920 to 1960, the union had won major improvements in wages, working hours, and benefits for hundreds of thousands of miners. But by 1968, the union was in serious trouble. Lewis had retired, and his successor, W.A. Tony Boyle, had taken the organization in a very different direction. Miners across the coal fields were growing angry. Safety conditions remained dangerous. Black lung disease was destroying thousands of lives without any official recognition or compensation. And Boyle showed little interest in fighting for either issue. He was more focused on maintaining his own power within the union than on representing the men who paid their dues. The dissatisfaction ran deep enough that by early 1969, tens of thousands of West Virginia miners launched an unauthorized wildcat strike, walking off the job without union approval, to demand that the state legislature recognize black lung as a compensable occupational disease. Approximately 40,000 miners participated. It was one of the largest wildcat strikes in American history. Their families marched with them. Physicians who had been treating the disease for years spoke publicly about what they were seeing in their patients' lungs. The pressure worked. West Virginia passed a black lung compensation law in March of 1969. It was a victory the national union leadership had done nothing to help them win. The miners had done it themselves, against the company, against the government, and against their own union. The Farmington disaster of November 1968 did not happen in isolation. It was the worst coal mine explosion in the United States since the Spring Hill disaster in Nova Scotia in 1958, and it landed on a country already raw from a brutal year. 1968 had already seen the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy, the violence at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, and the escalating casualties of the Vietnam War. And now, on television screens across America, families watched footage of black smoke pouring from a hillside in West Virginia, while rescue workers stood helplessly at the mine entrance. The governor of West Virginia arrived. The president of Consolidation Coal Company, John Corcoran, made a statement that outraged the mining community. He called the company's safety record outstanding, even as 78 men lay dead inside his mine. Tony Boyle, the UMWA president, stood beside Corcoran and said essentially the same thing. The reaction from miners was immediate and furious. The disaster became the clearest possible evidence that the system protecting American coal miners, the union, the companies, and the federal government, was broken. Congressional hearings followed. Journalists began investigating conditions across the coal fields. Ralph Nader, already famous for his work on automobile safety, connected with young activists in West Virginia who wanted to push for stronger mine safety legislation. Within a year, that pressure would produce the most significant coal mine safety law in American history. In December of 1969, President Richard Nixon signed the Federal Coal Mine Health and Safety Act into law. It took effect in 1970 and immediately changed the legal landscape for every underground mine in the United States. Federal inspectors were now required to visit underground mines 4 times per year, not as a courtesy, but as a legal mandate, with authority to issue citations and shut down operations where life-threatening conditions were found. Dust levels were regulated for the first time at the federal level, directly targeting the conditions that caused black lung disease. Compensation programs were established for miners already disabled by the disease and for the widows of those who had died from it. The law also gave individual miners new rights, including the right to report unsafe conditions without fear of retaliation. The numbers tell the story of what the law accomplished. In 1968, 311 coal miners died in work-related accidents. In 1970, the first full year under the new law, the number was 260. By the mid-1970s, it had dropped below 200. By 1980, it was under 150. The decline continued for decades. By 2014, only 16 coal miners died in work-related accidents in the entire United States, the lowest number ever recorded. The change did not happen because mining became easy or comfortable. It happened because enough men died, and enough families refused to accept that as inevitable. The wife of a coal miner in 1968 carried a weight that never fully lifted. Every morning, she watched her husband leave the house before dawn. Every shift, she did what she needed to do: cooking, cleaning, raising children, managing whatever budget the week's wages allowed, with one part of her mind always somewhere underground. The mining community was close in the way that communities formed around shared risk tend to be. Neighbors knew each other's schedules. Women kept track of whose husband was on which shift. When a mine accident happened, word spread fast, and the women gathered, because gathering was the only thing they could do while they waited for news. In the company towns, the women had also played a larger role than many people realized. During strikes, they organized, they marched, they withheld labor of their own, refusing to cook for scabs, blocking roads with their bodies, making it clear that the fight for safer mines was not just their husbands' fight. In the years following Farmington, women from mining families testified before state legislatures about the black lung deaths they had watched happen slowly inside their own homes. They described what it looked like when a man who had spent 30 years underground could no longer walk from one room to another without stopping to catch his breath. Their testimony was not abstract. It was specific and devastating, and it helped move legislation that the mining companies had spent years blocking. The coal miner of 1968 left behind a legacy that goes far beyond the tunnels he worked in. The disasters, the strikes, the legislation, and the slow, painful fight for recognition of black lung disease reshaped the entire American labor movement's approach to occupational health and safety. The Federal Coal Mine Health and Safety Act of 1969 became a model that other industries studied and eventually followed. The same principles: mandatory inspections, enforceable standards, worker protections against retaliation, and compensation for occupational disease spread across manufacturing, construction, and chemical industries throughout the 1970s. The men who worked the mines of West Virginia, Kentucky, and Pennsylvania in 1968 did not set out to change history. They set out to earn a living. Most of them had gone into the mines because that was the work available, because their fathers had done it, because the coal company was the only significant employer for 100 miles in any direction. But in fighting for their own survival, demanding that the air they breathed underground be measurable and regulated, that a disease their industry had caused be recognized and compensated, that a man's death not simply be absorbed as a cost of doing business, they built something that outlasted them. The 78 men sealed inside the No. 9 mine in Farmington never came home. But the law their deaths helped produce has been credited with saving thousands of lives in the decades that followed. In 2018, 50 years after the explosion, hundreds of people gathered at the Farmington Memorial to read their names aloud. Some of them were grandchildren who had never met the men whose names they were saying. But they knew who those men were, and they knew what they had given.